were the Gospels really anonymous? Well, one of the things you have to do whenever you're looking at history, now we're looking at things from the perspective of history here and reason, right? Not presuming faith, we're just looking at it as from a historical perspective, is you have to ascertain, well, who wrote these books that we call the four Gospels? And there are basically two ways to tell who wrote any kind of book. You have to look at either, number one, internal evidence from inside the book itself, or external evidence from people who are around when the book was written, right? So take my own book, for example. If you want to know who wrote this book, there's two ways to figure it out. First, you can open it up, or you look at the cover, and say, it says who what? Brant Pitre, right? So that's evidence that I wrote the book. But, as you know, books can be forged, can't they? You can write a book falsely and attribute it to someone else in their name. And so you also, if there's any reason for suspicion, can use external evidence. In other words, you can consult people who were contemporaries of the author, or people who knew the author, and ask them, did that person write this book? Right? And to corroborate it. So you could ask my wife, did Brant write a book last year? And she will tell you yes. And it caused her many headaches, right? Okay. Of me working late nights and that kind of thing, trying to hammer this thing out. So those are the kinds of ways you can find out about a modern book, and the same thing's true about ancient books. You look at the internal evidence and you look at the external evidence. So let's look at the evidence here. Page 1. Internal evidence from the Gospels themselves is striking. If you go back to the ancient Greek manuscripts and look at what they actually contain, you'll discover something very interesting. I remember when I was a doctoral student at Notre Dame, I began studying this for the first time, and by that point I had accepted the theory that the Gospels were originally anonymous, but I'd also been trained to learn Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic, and so I wanted to say, well, let me go look at the manuscripts themselves. I want to see the anonymous copies. And guess how many anonymous copies I found? Exactly 0. There are no anonymous manuscripts of the Old Testament. There are no anonymous manuscripts of the Gospels in Greek, even though we have hundreds, in fact thousands, of manuscripts in the New Testament. None of them are anonymous. And there are other problems with the theory. So, number one, no anonymous manuscripts. Why? They don't exist, and no evidence that they ever did. Number two, if you think about it for a minute, the idea that the Gospels were originally anonymous is kind of actually an incredible theory. According to the standard theory, the Gospels were originally composed without any titles. And then they circulated. They were copied by hand in manuscripts decade after decade after decade for 100 years until the 2nd century, before anyone said, you know what, in order to give these books some authority, we need to attribute them to apostles, to people with authority. So 100 years later, the titles were added to the books, according to this theory, by scribes who wanted to give them much needed authority. Now, the problem with that is, if that is actually what it would have happened, first of all, we would expect to see some anonymous copies, and we don't have a single one. Second problem with the anonymous theory is, if the Gospels really circulated for 100 years before the titles were added, then how did all the scribes know to attribute the exact same titles? You understand what I mean? Like, in other words, if you're a scribe in Africa and a scribe in Italy in the 2nd century AD, and you got this anonymous document, how do you both know to attribute to Matthew, and both know to attribute it to Luke, and both know to attribute it to John? What you would expect if they were anonymous is that you'd have different scribes attributing them to different people. Make sense? All right? So it would actually take a miracle for all the manuscripts we possess to have, coincidentally been attributed to the same people. So the theory is incredible. It doesn't make any sense. In other words, it's not logically possible. Oh, which, by the way, too, we can contrast that with the evidence from another book in the New Testament, the letter to the Hebrews. We read from the letter to the Hebrews. The letter to the Hebrews was actually anonymous. It doesn't have a title. It doesn't have a name in the book. And so guess what happened in the manuscripts? Some people attributed it to Paul. Some people attributed it to Luke. Some people attributed it to Titus. Some say that Titus wrote it for Paul. So in other words, there were debates about it because it was actually an anonymous book. But as we'll see in a second, there's no debate about the Gospels. Third and final problem. If you really wanted to give your book authority, right, and you're faking it, so you're just forging it, why would you attribute your Gospel to Mark or Luke? When I was younger, I used to think they were apostles, but they're not. Mark was a companion of Peter. Luke was a companion of Paul. Neither one of them were eyewitnesses to Jesus. They were the companions of apostles. So if you're trying to give your book authority, why Mark and Luke? These guys are nobodies. If you want to give authority, why not attribute your gospel falsely to Peter or to Thomas? Or for that matter, hey, if you're faking it, why not go straight to the top and say the gospel of Jesus himself, right? Just go to the top and say Jesus wrote this book. That would give it authority. But they didn't do that. Why? Because they were never anonymous, and they weren't forged, and they weren't first falsely attributed. All right? In fact, if you look at the handout there, all of the Greek manuscripts we possess are completely unanimous in attributing the 4 Gospels to these 4 men. Number 1, Matthias, otherwise known as Matthew, the tax collector and one of the 12 apostles. Number 2, Marcus, known as Mark, the companion of Paul and also a scribe of St. Peter. Number 3, Lucas, also known as Luke, who was a Gentile physician and the companion of St. Paul. I've given you the New Testament references there, giving us that evidence. And then finally, Ioannes, John, the beloved disciple, the fisherman, and one of the 12. So all of the internal evidence we possess is unanimous in attributing it to these men. And I might add here one quick point too. If you wanted somebody to trust the author, you wouldn't attribute your gospel to Matthew. He was a tax collector. He's basically the ancient version of an IRS agent, okay? And everybody trusts the IRS, right? No. You don't pick the IRS guy to attribute your gospel to if you want somebody to trust it. Why might Matthew have been the one who wrote the gospel? Well, another objection scholars will sometimes say is, how could some illiterate fisherman of Jesus have ever written a book? All right, so there's one scholar, Bart Ehrman, who makes this claim regularly. He says, and I'm quoting basically here, even if the apostles had wanted to write a gospel, they wouldn't have been able because they were a bunch of illiterate fishermen. Now this frustrates me because, yes, it's true. 4 of Jesus' 12 apostles were fishermen. Peter, Andrew, James, and John. But not all of the apostles were fishermen, right? And yes, it's true. It does say in the book of Acts that Peter and John were unlettered. They were untutored. They were unschooled. They were, technically speaking, illiterate. But that's not the only apostles, y'all. There's another apostle called Matthew, who was a tax collector. And to be a tax collector, guess what you had to write out? Tax documents. You're going to be doing that soon, right? It's coming, right? It's coming real soon, okay? So taxes required literacy, and Matthew was a literate apostle. So think about it. If you're all sitting around, you're studying with Jesus for 3 years, and you're like, man, this guy's a really good teacher. Maybe somebody should take some notes. Let's see. Fisherman, tax collector. Who do you think might be the one to write some of this down? It's Matthew, obviously. You see? Makes sense. So even that issue is not a deal breaker. And finally, too, even if John was illiterate, like even if he couldn't write, which is what the book of Acts actually says, then, okay, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure this out. If you can't write yourself, but you want to write a book, what might you do? What possible avenue might you have? Especially if you're the bishop of a church in Ephesus. What do? You get a secretary to write it for you, and then you dictate it, no? Right? Ancient people had secretaries just like modern day people could have secretaries, and that's what actually some of the church fathers say about John. So all the internal evidence points to Matthew and John, 2 apostles, and then Mark and Luke, the companions of apostles, as being the authors of the text. Now, but that's just internal evidence. That could all be fake in theory. In principle, it could all be forged. So now we also want to look at, what about external evidence? Well, I have a whole chapter in this book called The Early Church Fathers, where I go through the ancient Christian writings outside of the New Testament by men who knew the apostles, or by men who knew people who knew the apostles. They were called the Apostolic Fathers. And these are fascinating books. They come from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries A.D., and I never even knew they existed. When I was younger, I thought the New Testament was all we had. And then I began to read the early church fathers, and it really changed my view of this question, because I went into the fathers expecting that what I had learned as an undergraduate, that nobody knows who wrote the Gospels and they were anonymous. I thought the fathers were going to say that. I thought the people closest to the events would not know, that they'd be kind of vague or fuzzy on who wrote the Gospels. And instead, guess what I found? The church fathers are completely unanimous on the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, having been written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So I'll give you one example here. This is just one. The whole chapter deals with it. This is from St. Irenaeus, External Evidence. Irenaeus was a disciple of a man called Polycarp, whose feast we celebrated just a couple days ago. He was martyred. And Polycarp was a disciple of John himself. So Irenaeus is just one person removed from the Apostle John. And this is what he wrote in the 2nd century. Quote, Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching in Rome. So Peter and Paul are still alive. Matthew writes his gospel. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke also, the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. And afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who had also leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence in Ephesus. At Ephesus in Asia, meaning Asia Minor there, Turkey, modern-day Turkey. That's from his book, Against Heresies, chapter 3, paragraph 1. Okay, so notice what Irenaeus is saying here. Matthew and John, the two apostles, and eyewitnesses, are the authors of the 1st and 4th Gospels, and then the other 2 Gospels are written by men who knew the apostles. And Mark in particular is interesting here. Although Mark wasn't a disciple himself, where did he get his information from? According to Irenaeus, he got it from Peter, right? So even though Mark himself is not an eyewitness, he's taking down eyewitness testimony. Just as if you wanted to interview someone today who fought in the Vietnam War and the Korean War, even the World War II, you might not have been there, but you're getting eyewitness testimony from that person. All right, so in a long story short, both the internal and the external evidence points to the Gospels being written by the apostles and their followers, by eyewitnesses and their successors. All right? There is no shred of evidence that the Gospels were ever anonymous.